friend's off to his yeshiva, so I should be back in my apartment in about. So to go over briefly about what's been going on, a lot of people are talking about the what, and usually when they talk about the what, they talk only from one perspective, but they don't talk about the why and the who and who's profiting and who's not. So first of all this situation happening right now started with a conversation around what is going on in a community in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, also called by the Jewish community as Shimon HaTzadik, because that's where we have a burial place of a very holy, righteous man, and where there was a Jewish community there as well. Now, this community existed, and in 1948, when the Jordanian army illegally took over the entirety of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, they expelled and ethnically cleansed all Jews from Judea and Samaria, including Jews in Jerusalem, and including Jews living in East Jerusalem, and including Jews living in Shimon HaTzadik, Sheikh Jarrah. Now, in 1967, which is almost, let's say, 20 years after 1948, Israel miraculously in the Six-Day War take over again Judea and Samaria, and they take Jerusalem as well, and they're able to reunify Jerusalem. Now, the Jewish homeowners of these homes in Sheikh Jarrah now had Israeli citizenship and went to the courts of Israel and said, listen, 20 years ago, our homes were stolen. They were stolen by the Jordanians and given to Jordanian families. Those Jordanian families are renting our homes to Palestinians. They had not given them to Palestinians. They were renting them to Palestinians. And we are the true homeowners. These are our deeds. We never sold them. They were stolen. And we want them back. And there was a court process that went from 1967 till 1982 that finished in 1982 with the courts determining that these homes were owned by Jews. However, the residency of the Palestinians would have to be protected and respected. So they ruled that instead of paying the rent to the Jordanian families, you would just have to pay the same rent to the Jewish families that own those homes. Now, the Palestinian families decided not to pay rent. They just stopped paying rent altogether, because now that they no longer had to pay rent to the Jordanian families, they decided to not pay rent to the Jewish families. And since 82 till now, there's been another court procedure of what to do with this situation. And the conclusion was, basically, if you guys do not pay, then we're going to have to evict people for not paying. So from 82 till 2021, they were in a process of potential evictions. And now that the evictions have started, people took this situation, and rather than talking about these are 8 homes, there's a civil dispute between people saying that they own the homes and they say they own the homes. Regardless of what you believe, the collection of facts that you've come to your conclusion, there was clearly a due process of many, many years. And the conclusion was that these homes are owned by Jews. It has nothing to do with greater ideas of one versus the other. It's purely about a civil dispute over 8 homes. But instead of doing that, people took this situation and spun it into the Jews are trying to remove the Palestinians, Israel's trying to remove the Palestinians, which is obviously not what is going on. And they spun it into a different situation. Then after that, you had, it was still during Ramadan, and you had Ramadan being taken place also on the Al-Aqsa complex, which is for us the Temple Mount. And obviously the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa has always been a pressure point. It has historically been used as something where people who want to create tensions, people who want to create violence against the Jews will say the Jews are trying to take it over. And they use that when the Jews aren't doing that, and they'll use that as an excuse to enact violence. We saw this in the Hebron massacre in 1929, when Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the head of the Palestinian people, appointed by the British, and he said that the Jews are trying to take Al-Aqsa, which resulted in the Hebron community thinking that it was true and massacring the Jewish community of Hebron, and that Jewish community, eventually those that survived, leaving Hebron and leaving the presence of Jews from Hebron. So the pressure point of constantly bringing Al-Aqsa, whenever Al-Aqsa comes up in conversation, we always have to ask ourselves, who's benefiting from this recent clash of violence, because it's not something that's coincidental. Now, what happened during Ramadan, where people are praying there? Obviously, it's important to mention in the conversation that Jews never pray there. We can't pray there. We're not allowed to, which is a whole other topic, but they're praying there. And then there was a whole group of violent rioters that started throwing rocks over at the Kotel, that started throwing rocks at the police, that started shooting fireworks at the police. And so obviously when you have a violent riot, the police are going to respond to that violence and disperse the crowds. So the police use rubber bullets and tear gas in order to not physically injure anybody and to make sure that they don't have anybody dying, and to get the crowd that was being violent to disperse. Of course, when they had to disperse the crowd, everyone was together, so they had to disperse everyone. And rather the media reporting on the situation that the IDF was responding to a violent riot, they decided to report it as the police of Israel is not allowing the people who are praying on Al-Aqsa to pray. And so they're distorting the information. The next thing that was done was on Yom Yerushalayim, where we were all here in Jerusalem and we were celebrating and dancing and rejoicing over the liberation and reunification of Jerusalem. There was a fire that was lit by individual Palestinians who shot rockets at a tree. I have a friend who I'm dropping off here is actually at Esha Torah's, the yeshiva right in front of the Kotel, and he and his friends saw, and someone even took it on film, of Palestinian individuals shooting fireworks down specifically at the tree over and over until it caught on fire. And what you see Jews dancing and a fire being caught on the Palestinian side where they control. Now, what happened was the Jews were dancing either way because they were dancing all day, and they lit a fire, and it just so happens that they continued to dance when there was the fire because they weren't going to stop the dance. And so you see this image, and the media is reporting it as Jews light Al-Aqsa on fire and rejoice and dance. So obviously not factual. And then Hamas gets involved, starts shooting rockets at Jerusalem. It was the first time that I ever heard of rockets being fired at Jerusalem. And then they start shooting rockets because the IDF retaliates, and they start shooting rockets at Tel Aviv, and then you get into an exchange of rockets. But what is the breakdown analysis of why this situation took place in the first place is we have to question who is truly profiting from this. Now, last week, we were supposed to have the election for the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is on their 16th year of their 4-year term. Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen as the president of the Palestinian Authority, and he was supposed to have an election. And all of a sudden, now that there's tensions, now that there's conflict, there's no more election. And not only that, because Hamas started to get involved and started shooting rockets and started being the basically the standing power force against the state of Israel, then Hamas was seen as the favorable choice as a sort of retaliation and revolution and resistance against Israel. And now they're the favored option politically amongst the Palestinian community because they were seen as the greatest threat or the greatest attackers towards Israel. So we have to understand who is profiting at the end of this situation. Definitely not the Palestinian people. Civilians are losing their homes, civilians are being killed. Definitely not the Israeli people. Civilians are losing their homes, civilians are being killed. So who is truly profiting? Not the people, but those that are in power that intentionally used this moment and this situation for political reasons and political gain. And what you see in the media is everyone taking all the context out of it. They don't care what's the truth. They don't care why this is happening in the first place. They care to use this situation in order to use real pain, real human lives as sort of political ammunition to use that to delegitimize and demonize Israel and the Jewish people. And this has been something that's been happening for a very long time, and this is just another round of it. And that's basically the breakdown of the situation. Now we've gone into a ceasefire. Hopefully, we're not going to go into another round of exchanges, because if the situation gets worse for this situation, then I might go into reserves. Other people will lose their lives on both sides. So I hope that this is the end of this, and that everyone who profited from this has filled their level of greed, that they're willing to use humans for their own political gain, and that now that things are going to settle down, we can focus on creating real solutions and restructuring society to fix the injustices that both experience and for us to fulfill our aspirations. So that's a quick breakdown on what's been going on here in the region. Of course, there's also the issue of internal politics, such as the riots, Arabs against Jews, Jews against Arabs. And the reason for why that exists is because you have to imagine, what if we were given the information in our media and told that Jews are being displaced from communities because they're Jews, that Jews on our Temple Mount are being arrested and shot with rubber bullets and with tear gas for praying and for practicing and for celebrating, let's say, Rosh Hashanah, or for doing Yom Kippur, and then that the other side is burning our temple and celebrating when our temple is being burnt. If that was the information that we were given, whether true or not, but that we believed in, I'm sure there would have been a retaliation of of what's going on, and the Jews would retaliate. So it's not that the Arab population in Israel has a fundamental problem with Israel. Now they're using this opportunity to retaliate. It's more they truly believe wrong information. They were told a perspective that makes Israel seem as the worst thing in the world and directly attacking them, and now they're reacting to that wrong information. So we also have to take into consideration what is the information being shared on both sides that is causing this reaction in the first place, and how do we better communicate and share the truth so that this doesn't happen in our society.
Thank you for an amazing introduction. While you were talking, I got the same message 3 times, which is, I think a lot of, you have a lot of Jewish people who, when it came to, Black Lives Matter, were very vocal, both on social media, but also in general in terms of protests. And a lot of Jewish people, especially in the diaspora, feel very abandoned by the world in general, but the media in particular. And you said the media is portraying it in this way. And the question is this just, age-old anti-Semitism, and we should just get used to it? Or is this something particular that the media does not want to see the Jewish side of the story, or the Israeli side of the story? What is motivating this? And not just obviously from the media, but also in the not so long ago, media was something that was in the hands of the few, but now that media is in the hands of the many, and every person is a broadcaster, it's not getting better. It's not, the democratization of media seems to be working not in our favor. And how do you see that?
I think, first of all, mainstream media, these news networks, all have interests, whether it's they're being funded by people who are on top and they have their own political agenda, or that they have to narrate a certain part of the story of a news segment in order to fit their audiences, or that they want to focus on things that will invoke fear and get more people to watch, as if this is some sort of soccer match happening in this country with this conflict, and then take the side in order to fit the audience that they're trying to sell advertisements for. In terms of the media that is being disseminated on social media, which is not necessarily profitable, the reality is that today culture has evolved to a position where it's cool to be anti the Jewish people and anti-Israel, and it's not cool to be pro the Jewish people and pro-Israel. So I think we're seeing a reflection of the reality of pop culture, and a lot of Jews are surprised by this, but this is something that I've known existed for many years, which is why I dedicate everything that I do to this, because I understand how much of a problem we're in, whereas everyone is very oblivious to the situation. And now that it's blowing up in our faces, people are now saying, whoa, 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 how is this? Like, I can't believe this is going on. And it's like, yeah, I mean, you failed to do what you were supposed to do, because we said never again after the Shoah, not as a statement that because we say it's not going to happen again, but we take a generational commitment to make sure it doesn't happen again. And for the past 20 years in intellectual spaces and on college campuses, they've been pushing this agenda that has now reached the mainstream level of convincing the next generation's political and intellectual class that the source of the problem of all society is the Jews in Israel. And now it's in a reality where the society and the pop culture has shifted to hate us. Now, if we want to change, we have to take the power into our own hands and start shifting the culture backwards. But it starts first by standing up for ourselves. How do we expect, these minority groups to respect us if we don't respect ourselves? You go to a college campus and a student says, let's say, a student says something racist or says something sexist. I can guarantee you that almost every single Black student and female student is conditioned and prepared to stand up against that and to call it out. And the society is conditioned and prepared as well to side with that student against xenophobia, against their community. However, if a professor or a student says something anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, most Jewish students either don't know how to respond or are too afraid to respond, or think that they're better not responding because they want to protect their grade and they want to protect their career, rather than understanding that if you allow anti-Semitism and this darkness to grow, your career and everything else that you own will be taken, including your life, if you don't actually stand up. So it's actually way more dangerous to not stand up than to do nothing, even though on the short term you may benefit from that, on the long term you won't. So I think that the response that should be understood is the reason why we're here is because of us. We had a responsibility to minimize anti-Semitism, to get a society to recognize that as something wrong, and to be able to stand up for our rights and to spread the truth and spread light. And we failed at our job. We failed at our responsibility. So it's not a time to realize that we have a responsibility, and to change that now with the younger generation.
Thank you very much. Okay, now on to very specific questions. These questions are what people are trying to address right now in their schools. And it's true for a lot of people, it's a wake-up moment, and people don't know how to respond. So these are questions, and guys, you can send me on WhatsApp or on the chat questions that you have, and I can unmute you if you'd like to address them directly to Rudy. So the first question I have is, somebody writes, I'm having a lot of conversations with pro-Palestinians, and they've consistently brought up the segregated road systems in Israel. At first glance, they seem pretty bad. I honestly have no clue what to say. I would really appreciate your help, as I am a very proud Zionist. Thank you.
Sure. So this is more so the argument of, is Israel an apartheid? And so the segregation that exists is really where you have communities like in Hebron, where you have the Jews that are not allowed to go to the Palestinian side and the Palestinians that are not allowed to go to the Jewish side. So the segregation exists both ways. And if you want to take Hebron as the main example that is usually used, 97% of that city is accessed by Palestinians. 3% of that city is accessed by Jews. Jews cannot go to 97% of that city, and Palestinians cannot go to 2% because 1% of that 3%, they're still allowed to go in 2% of that city. So yes, there's a division of movement based on the jurisdiction that you live under, but it's even worse for the Jewish people when it comes to those places. Now, if you want to talk about limitation of movement on the collective land as a whole, the reality is that we're living in a situation, or first let me describe what apartheid is in the first place. First of all, the term apartheid is a term that specifically talks about the South African experience. And anyone using the term apartheid to describe another situation is appropriating the suffering that people in South Africa have gone through, because it's not a term to describe a political system or a structure of a society. It's a term created to describe what happened specifically in South Africa. Now, specifically in South Africa, you had one government, one land, and different rights for different peoples that were under that same government and under that power, specifically giving different rights dependent on their skin color. In Israel, although you have a messed up division of land, you have many different territories under different leaderships, under different governments, with different rights for different peoples based on where you live and what government you live. So those living in Israel, 20% of the population is Arab, or some identify as Palestinian, and they have equal rights. In fact, one can even argue that they have more rights because they don't have to serve in the army like many Israeli Jews have, or other people of like the Druzi background and other. And usually when they do the army, which is 3 years for guys and 2 years for girls, Israelis want to go and travel after, but to travel you have to work. So they work for a year and then they go travel for about a year. And so basically 5 years since they graduate at 18, they come back and start their education, start their first degree. And the Arab students within Israel are already on their master's degree after they even first started. So usually if you want to become a doctor, it takes many, many years to go through that type of education. And many Israeli Jews end up not being doctors because it doesn't make sense in their timeline, which is why the Arab population in Israel is 20%, and the amount of doctors that you have in Israel that are Arab is over 40%. So one could even argue that people are at more of an advantage when they're not Jewish in this land than not. However, in the land, you have equal rights. You have Arabs that are part of the government, police, army, lawyers, doctors, janitors, whatever they are, they have equal access to society. Now, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is divided into 3 areas. I'm against this division, but it was a division that was agreed upon by both leaderships, both the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government. And it dictates that Area A would be completely controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Area B would be controlled by the Palestinian Authority in terms of its municipality and security with Israel. And Area C would be completely controlled by Israel. So the reality is that Palestinians that are living in Area A, B, and C cannot come into Israel. Israelis cannot go into Area A because it's only for Palestinians. Israelis cannot live in Area B because it's only inhabited by Palestinians. And so you have a limitation of movement that goes both ways. I can't go into Gaza. I can't go into Bethlehem. I can't go into most of Hebron. I can't go into Ramallah. I can't go into Jericho. I can't go into all these places because I'm an Israeli. And Palestinians that are living under the sovereignty of where they're living are not allowed to come into Israel unless they have work permits. So you have a limitation on both sides. It's not only on one side. So they'll take the limitation of one side, which again should not exist, because we should be able to access this land equally and be able to all live here. But the limitation exists on both sides, and it's a lot more complex than appropriating a term like apartheid, which defines limitation of movement for one people with one government over one land. We have many different territories, many leaderships, many divisions, and the limitation of movement goes on both sides dependent on the jurisdiction that you live under. We can criticize this situation and the structure and try to change it, but when we avoid actually dealing with what truly exists that is problematic and rather use terms that apply to other peoples and that don't even describe the situation to demonize Israel and the Jewish people and delegitimize us in the international crowd, then we're not even attempting to solve the problem. You're just using the problem as a form of political ammunition to attack Israel. And with that, Rabbi, I am at my apartment. I have to go in the parking lot under, so I'm going to lose service. So I can either continue from the car, or you can give me 5 minutes to just run up to my apartment and log in from my computer. What should we do?
I would ask people to vote, but since only less than 10% of people have their videos on, I don't know if they should have a voice. So we'll wait for you to get to your desk while everyone puts their videos on. And
okay, give me 5 minutes
and
to park
everyone
my
can send
car.
in questions meanwhile.
Yes, I'll be really quick. I'll be back as soon as possible.
Let's see how quick you can do this.
Yeah.
Do you want me to sing for you, everybody? The problem with all his answers, he's so eloquent, well-spoken, but it's so quick. You wish you could kind of store that as a soundbite to be able to deliver it on demand. But I'm thinking of just like co-opting his voice and being able to just press play every so often. Okay, I'll be quiet now. I think silence is probably better. L'chaim, everyone. How many cameras are on now? What are we, 8%? No, now we're 10%. So 10, that's quite good. We confirmed earlier today. I wrote about it on Friday. I'll send out a flyer just after this, but we have now Colonel Richard Kemp joining us on Thursday night at 8 p.m. A similar Q&A type session. Really an amazing man. You should Google him if you haven't heard of him, but I'll send out a WhatsApp and email after this talk on that point. Anyway, give 1 or 2 more minutes and Rudy will. I think he actually went to get a shawarma. I mean, I'm just saying, how big is this apartment building? Seriously, he did, right? If he comes wiping his, well, no, it's got to be. In Jerusalem, there's no high rises, so yeah, definitely. He's gone to the corner shop. Who can blame him? Somebody wrote that, which is, I think, very important. There should be a list of questions that are regularly discussed and the answers typed out and then given out to people to learn, a booklet, especially for kids. So there are such things. If you'd like, I can send things like that to you. Yeah. Okay, I think he's back. No. Okay. Rudy is back. Let me spotlight for everyone. Okay. I think I need to ask you to unmute. Yeah, one second. Let me unmute you. Okay, you need to unmute yourself now. Okay, great. Yeah, much better. Okay. Wow, we have a lot of questions. I'm gonna have to do them in order. Okay, so just 1 second. Okay, so first of all, by the way, the question about the road system, somebody asked if you could please make an Insta video because they keep on getting asked it. So if that could be one, I think, again, this information is really important for people. The second question is, many people are disputing the fact that Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel, saying the Palestinians were there first. And the final line of this question is, again, no clue how to combat that. So your best response on that.
Okay, so now we have to define terms because we're using a term like indigeneity and we have to understand what that even means in the first place. So there are three things that make a people indigenous. The first thing is that this is the pre-colonial identity of a people that are the descendants of the First Nation and that are fundamentally rooted to a specific piece of land. The second is that they have always maintained a constant presence on that land. And the third is that that group of people self-identifies as indigenous. If we look at the Jewish people, we're the descendants of the First Nation being the Hebrews became the Israelites became the Jews, the Judeans, and that is the same nation that we come from. We are also the pre-colonial identity prior to its colonization and its renaming to something else. This is our identity. And in terms of self-identifying, we had the World Zionist Congress in 2015 that had a vote that decided to identify the Jews as indigenous officially. So we fit every single definition. Now, in terms of Palestinians, they're not indigenous by the definition. That doesn't mean that they don't have a relationship to the land. That doesn't mean that they don't also come from the land, because actually 30 to 60% of Palestinians actually descend from Jews, whether they were forced or chose to convert to Christianity, or whether they were forced or chose to convert to Islam, and eventually with time Arabized and became part of this new identity, which is a valid identity because the land was called Palestine for 2,000 years. So a group of people for 2,000 years living on this land, whatever they were, identified with Palestinian because that was the name of the land. However, it's the identity that was created after the colonization of the land, the post-colonial identity. In fact, the land was named Palestine as an act of colonization. Why? Because when the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago destroyed Judea, burned down Jerusalem, took the Jews as slaves, our Jewish warriors fought to the death in the Colosseum that was built off of the ruins of Jerusalem and with the money looted from Jerusalem, they decided to embarrass us by renaming the land of our people, Judea/Israel, to Palestine. Why? Because Palestine comes from a biblical story of a people called the Plishtim, the Philistines. And if anyone knows the story of the Philistines, the story of Samson and Delilah was a Philistine woman. If anyone knows the story of David and Goliath was a Moabite general in the Philistine army. So we had a very negative experience with the Philistines. So when the Romans conquered Judea, they decided to rename our land by one of our former greatest enemies, the Palestinians, the Plishtim, which are not related to today's Palestinians. And the Plishtim, the word in Hebrew comes from the root word polesh. Polesh in Hebrew means to invade. So Plishtim literally means, in plural, invaders. And Plishtin, to name the land Palestine, in Hebrew really means invaded lands. And so they renamed our land as an act of colonization and humiliation to invaded lands. And this was 2,000 years ago. Islam was born 1,500 years ago, and Islam and Arabs didn't spread right away. It took about 200 years. So we have about a 700-year gap between the renaming of the land to Palestine as an act of colonization by the Romans and the first time that Arabs even started to spread out of Arabia through the spread of Islam. So the reality is that the Palestinian identity, although a valid identity, a real identity existing on this land, connected to this land, formed on this land. They are the post-colonial identity. And the whole point of creating this term indigenous is to preserve identities prior to the colonization and not allow them to be erased by the newer, more modern identities, which still have validity to exist, but it's a term to protect the pre-colonial identity of its native people. So when you dig in the land, you find Jewish history, you don't find Palestinian history. That doesn't mean that Palestinians don't have a right to live here equally with us and don't have a connection to this land as well. And we shouldn't create a society that is equal for all of us living here. But the reality is that if we're going to use the term and the standards that the world's use for people, then we have to be very honest of what those terms mean and how they apply to different people and what is really the descendants of the original people. And anyone trying to make the claim that the Jews aren't indigenous to Judea, either they're refusing to learn science and archaeology and history, or they're miseducated, and it's our responsibility to educate them. And just for the comment that was made earlier, Rudy, can you make a video on that topic? Of course I can, but I'm not the answer to our problems. The reason I make this content and share this information is for everyone else to be able to take this and spread the light, because I can't be in all places at once. I'm not the answer. I'm just not a part of the problem. And I encourage everyone to really empower themselves, educate themselves, and not be a part of the problem either, because if enough of us was doing this, we wouldn't have problems in the first place.
Wow, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to not discriminate on the questions and just ask them. And when you are ready to log off, you'll tell me. We have a tremendous amount of questions to get through. So somebody, no, and the real reason why, very often I moderate questions in talks, but I know the pain that so many people are going through right now, especially in school, that, even if it's an answer that others might know, I think it's important for them to hear it from you so they can articulate it in the wonderful way you do. As a Jewish minority, somebody asked, I feel a lot of pressure to defend Israel against misinformation, but I don't know enough of the facts. For instance, how do you combat the argument people make about the difference in death tolls and the fact that more Palestinian citizens are dying from the rockets in Israel? I tried to mention the Iron Dome, but I was wondering if there is a clearer way to tackle it.
Well, first of all, the reality is that any death on either side of civilians is horrible. Life is beautiful and should be preserved. We're all part of one body, which is this world that we live in, and we're all part of human beings. We're all created in God's image. We're all part of one. So any death of civilians or any human in reality is a horrible situation. Now, to understand the what without the why is not caring about the what. Because if you care about Palestinians truly and those that are dying in Gaza, you have to care about why they're dying in the first place in order for that action to no longer happen. And if you only care about the fact that people are dying but don't care about why, then you don't really care about the what, and you're just trying to use the what for your agenda to push whatever type of political agenda that you have. It could be anti-Semitic, it could be something else, but you don't actually care about the real human beings. Now, if we want to understand what's going on, first of all, the authority there in Gaza is Hamas, and Hamas is shooting rockets from civilian locations onto Israeli civilians. Israeli civilians are protected, not 100%, but a decent amount by technology that Israel has invented, which is called the Iron Dome, that shoots rockets out in the sky before they hit Israel. Of course, not every single one is shot out, and many people have died, including Israeli Arabs in Israel. And in Gaza, Hamas puts their rockets in civilian locations such as hospitals, schools, homes of civilians, and Israel actually does something to limit the amount of casualties that are caused on the other side. First thing that they do is they call all the phones in the area and text message all the phones in the area, letting them know that there's going to be an attack in this specific location. Israel doesn't just fire back in general. They target the very specific house where it just so happened that they were shooting rockets from. And in fact, when they're already shooting rockets, it's allowed that they should already know that to get out of there, because this has now become a place that is shooting rockets onto Israel, and Israel is going to fire back to begin with. Then Israel does that first thing. The second thing they do is they send out drones that release leaflets written in Arabic, letting people know to leave the area in case they didn't receive the phone call or the text message. And the third thing they do is they have something called a knocker bomb, which is basically a huge firecracker noise. It's not really an explosion. It's just a big noise that allows people to know, hey, in 10 minutes, get out of here. If you don't, there's going to be the real explosion. And then they target this very specific house or the specific building that Hamas is shooting rockets from in order to prevent rockets from falling onto civilians that Israel is responsible for doing. So If you don't include the context as to Hamas then also forcing civilians to stay in those homes in order for them to be killed, then you're not actually addressing why they're being killed in the first place. And to understand this scenario, we have to put ourselves in the impossible scenario. So let's say, this is an example I give to a lot of people. Let's say you're in a house and you're living with your family, and you look outside of your window and there's your neighbor's house, and you look into their window and you notice that your neighbor is preparing a rocket launcher and is preparing and telling you, I'm going to fire this into your house and kill you and your entire family. And you have a rocket launcher right next to you. What do you do? Do you shoot back into that house, kill that person, including civilians in the house? Or do you do nothing and allow you and your family to be killed? And the reason I'm giving this example is because it's an impossible situation. There's no way of making a choice here that you do the right thing. But the reason that you're even in this situation in the first place is because that person who forced you to take an action or not to take an action that resulted in innocent people dying. So we can't take the why out of the what. And if you truly care about the what, you care about the why. And if you're only talking to me about the what without the why, then you actually don't care about Palestinian lives or any human lives at all.
Thank you very much. So I guess this question is kind of a more meta question, which is, why do the Israeli ambassador and press representatives not articulate the arguments when they are on TV speaking with the press? For example, the rental dispute, we've never heard articulated by the Israelis, and I guess it goes for almost everything you say.
I mean, I have the same question, to be honest. And if they were to do it, then I wouldn't have to do what I'm doing, and I'd be, able to spend my time doing other things that I'd like to do in this life. This is not what I was born knowing that I would do. It's what life has brought me to do, and I've realized that it's a part of my tikkun, but it's not the first choice that I would do. I do it because I see that I have no other choice. Because if I don't do it, other people won't. Why they haven't gotten good at PR and being able to educate, I think they're just so disconnected from the reality. A lot of people in Israel live in a bubble and think the only thing going on here is Israel. There's a lot of ego and pride that think that they know what's everything's going on, and they're not willing to realize that they've been making mistakes for many years. They're constantly making the security argument, which doesn't work for a younger generation. So, for example, the name of this operation or this war is Guardian of the Walls. I mean, that's the worst sounding name I've ever heard in my life. I mean, this isn't Game of Thrones to talk about walls, and it just sounds like you're trying to get someone's pity of you protecting walls, which are the most unattractive word that you can choose. So it just shows in the way that they're projecting the message is they want the international community to feel that they're under security threat. So try to agree with us or to sympathize with us under our security agreement, and constantly the messaging that is being taught by pro-Israel organizations or by the government on the question that's being asked in the intellectual spaces on why does Israel have a right to exist and who are the Jewish people. The only things that you're hearing is Israel created the cherry tomato, Israel developed drip irrigation, Israel has startup nation, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, Israel does not have a right to exist because we created a small tomato for a salad. Israel does not have a right to exist because we created an application that avoids police and avoids traffic. Israel doesn't have a right to exist because we have a democracy. First of all, I think that the form of government that we have here is ridiculously horrible. That being said, I do believe in a representation government that represents its people. However, I don't expect anything less of the Jewish people than to have a democracy. If anything, I'd expect us to have something better than what is the lie of democracy and society that are really run by corporate interests. But that being said, there are countries in the world that aren't democracies, that are monarchies still, like Thailand and Morocco and Jordan, or semi-dictatorships like Singapore, which work well in their situation, and no one is questioning their legitimacy to exist. So why are we using superficial answers to answer a very deep question? That deep answer is the right for Israel to exist is because Israel is the story of a 4,000-year-old native people from the land of Judea that were physically and forcibly displaced by a Western white imperial nation called the Romans. Even during their displacement, they maintained a constant presence on their homeland. And after 2,000 years of extermination, persecution, and oppression, we created the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed, where for the first time in history, a native people decolonized their home, revived their language, revived their civilization, and kicked off the oppressive colonial force being the British. And when you talk about Israel in that language, you're actually speaking to your audience, which is a younger generation, which speaks in the language of justice and liberation and overcoming struggle, and then you're able to communicate. I think those that are in political role today are so disconnected from the way the conversation is going that they're failing. And so that's why I think people like me and all of you that are listening here, we have a greater responsibility that falls on our shoulders to be able to communicate our story for the failures that those that are supposed to lead us cannot do.
Talk about the younger generation. We have a question from a 13-year-old, which is many social media posts accuse us/me of ethnic cleansing. What is the best response?
Yes, so ethnic cleansing is the deliberate attempt to remove a population based on their ethnicity or on their identity. That has never existed. If we look at 1948, which is usually the example that people try to talk about ethnic cleansing, there was an all-out war, an ethnic war, where there were people displaced on both sides. In fact, sorry, I was just getting a call. You guys still hear me? Yeah. Okay. If it goes out, just raise your hand. Sometimes when I get, okay. So in 1948, you had an all-out war where the surrounding Arab countries, including the leaders of the local Palestinian Arab communities, decided to, from the river to the sea, ethnically cleanse the Jewish population and destroy the state of Israel and the even presence of Jews. This is what the leaders of those armies were saying when they were fighting and engaging in that war. They failed in that war, and during that war, there were people displaced on both sides because of war, and that's not a deliberate attempt to remove people. Now, people will often bring up something called Plandalet, which is the fourth option. And this is a plan that Israel executed to remove specific Palestinian, Israeli, Arab, whatever one wants to call it, but Arabs living in this land, communities that they themselves had either engaged with attacking and massacring Jewish communities or were aligned with the Arab armies that would have been used as springboards to attack and destroy the Jewish people. So only those communities that were enemy communities were removed. And the reason why it's not an ethnic cleansing is because if you look at other communities that weren't a problem, they weren't removed. 20% of Israel's population is Arab, aka Palestinian, and they weren't removed because they weren't a threat. So the attempt to ethnically cleanse is to remove someone based on their identity, not to be in an all-out war where you have to remove your enemies, those that are aligned and fighting you and actually in the practice killing you. And you cannot blame the consequences of the war on the side that was attacked. You cannot blame a rape victim for a woman trying to be raped by a man and her knowing Kav Maga and punching him in the face and knocking out his teeth. I don't think in a court of law, the person that was trying to rape the woman make the case that the woman should pay for his dental care because she knocked out his teeth. So you cannot blame the victim for defending themselves and blame the consequences of that situation for us that we're not in. And to take a situation and to take all the negativity and to focus only on one and not when it applies to the Jews, but only focus when it applies to the non-Jews and blame all that only on the Jews is exactly what anti-Semitism is. Taking the source of a problem and suffering of a situation and blaming it on the Jews is the formula for anti-Semitism, and that's exactly that.
Thank you very much. Guys, I see you're writing, why hasn't your question come up? There are a lot of questions. I'm doing this in order. It's all time-stamped, and we can verify this all afterwards if there's any dispute about this. So first of all, sorry, a question that I got today from somebody in the community, and sadly I got it also Erev Shabbat, which is, should I remove my mezuzah from my door in England? What do you have to say about that?
I'm going to say this, either fight back and win or leave. Don't hide who you are. Don't put your head down. Don't tuck in your Magen David. Don't hide your tzitzit. Don't take off your kippah. Don't take off your mezuzah. Either fight back and win or get out of there.
Thank you very much. We had this Shabbat after Friday night, everyone who wouldn't normally walk home with a kippah, we encouraged them to do so, and they did, and it was a very beautiful thing to see. Why are Arab Israelis not publicly voicing support for the way that Israel is defending itself from a terrorist organization?
So we haven't only been seeing a lack of response to what's been happening vis-a-vis Israel with Hamas and the retaliation on both sides, but we've also seen a lot of Israeli Arabs reacting and rioting in the streets and responding and protesting and so on and going on strikes. And like I said previously, when I first had the floor in the beginning, it's because they're given a very different set of information. They're being taught that the reality of what's happening right now is that the Jews are removing Arabs or Palestinians because they're Arab and Palestinian, that the Jews are preventing people from praying because they're Muslim, that the Jews are celebrating when buildings or when trees are being lit on fire, that the Jews are killing people in Gaza and they don't talk about the why, they just talk about the death rates, which again shows that they only care about the what, not the why. And when you have people that are great people but are given this information that you have this country or this force that is doing this against people that you're related to, of course they're going to turn against people because they should if that was true. The reality is that it's not, but they don't know that it's not. So I think we have to find a fix to how we disseminate information and how we have community relations with one another and understand what is going on and not allow people to manipulate us to get us to end up fighting each other. Because like I said, those that are profiting from this conflict, from this war, whether right now with Gaza or in general over the past 73 years, is definitely not the civilians on either side. It's sometimes and often the politicians, it's the media companies, it's these NGOs, it's even the weapon industry in America that forces Israel to be completely dependent on US-based weapons, which is why I'm against the foreign aid, and other individual forces that are not the populations here. So I think that we're still living in a reality where the British taught both sides that we were the enemies of each other. The same thing that they did to Pakistan, India, same thing they did to the ethnic groups in Afghanistan, the same thing they did to the ethnic groups in Nigeria, and to be honest, wherever they colonized, the British were masters of divide and conquer. And so they convinced the Arab population, the Palestinians, that their enemy was the Jew, that the Jews, the Zionists, the Israelis were the extension of the West that was here to take over the Middle East. And they convinced the Jews that the Palestinians were an extension of the pan-Arab societies and militaries that were seeking to ethnically cleanse the Jewish population. And so we were taught that the other is the enemy to our story. And the reality is that we are not, and that there's no future where either population disappears. And we're still living in this false movie of the idea of the other. And so a lot of the work that I do on the ground is to try to get Israelis and Palestinians to understand each other in order to move forward. And a great story to bring in from the Torah to understand the situation is we have Ishmael and Yitzhak, who are brothers, the children of Abraham. Ishmael, the listener of God, and Yitzhak, who's also someone who took on the message of oneness that Abraham gave. And they were both responsible to spread their father's message. However, they hated each other and fought wars against each other until Abraham dies and Ishmael and Yitzhak both come together to bury their father. And when they bury their father, they finally actually meet each other and realize who each other are and understand that they both have their own strengths and weaknesses, and they actually don't contradict, and they actually help one another and accompany one another. And that's when they make peace, when they finally realize who they are. And I think that the reality is that Israelis and Palestinians in general, Israelis and Arabs around the Middle East, have the wrong idea of each other, have so much fear that we think that, oh, if you trust them, they'll stab you in the back. And these are things being said on both sides. And until we rebuild that relationship, and maybe the symbolism of Abraham dying is maybe our egos dying or the wrong impression of the other dying, for us to be able to truly come back together, understand who we are, and be able to do what we're meant to do as the children of Abraham, to bring light into this world and spread the concept that we are all a part of one, not one individual God, but a God that is all encompassing and the oneness of the world. And that's kind of to show that Judaism is actually not monotheism, it's panentheism, not to be confused with pantheism, because monotheism is different than polytheism. Polytheism is the belief in many gods. Monotheism is the belief that one person or one item is a god, which is Christianity. And Judaism is that God is not one individual, but God is one. The universe, time, space, the world, history, people, nature, everything combined is one, and Hashem is one. Shema Yisrael Adonai Elonu Adonai Echad. God is one. And so that is the purpose of the followers of Ibrahim, and maybe we'll be able to accomplish that once we reconnect brothers together.
Thank you very much. I'm in a local school. How do I explain to the other kids in school? They get this information that Hamas is a regular army, a military division, and not a terrorist group. How do I respond to that?
So we have to first understand what is terrorism and understand its function as a tool. So terrorism is whenever you're seeking to cause terror, harm, or inflict pain onto, it could be an army or into a civilian population. And that's exactly what Hamas is doing. They're not targeting, the military bases. They're shooting onto civilians in order to cause terror to the people. Now, this has been done also during the intifadas, where the word intifada in Arabic means to shake off. Now, why is it called intifada? Why are they trying to shake off? Because in their ideology, they think they will terrorize the Jews until they will be shaken off from this land and choose to leave. So terrorism is a tool. It's an anti-colonial tool, and Jews even used it against the British to make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation. It could work against colonizers. However, when you use an anti-colonial tool against a native people like the Jewish people, who no matter what will never leave, and we will either die fighting or die of old age on this land, and use an anti-colonial tool against a native population that is 100 times stronger, they will respond 100 times stronger. So I think to make the argument that it is a terror organization, look at what they're doing, their actions, and to understand why what they're doing is wrong is because this tactic will never succeed in their ultimate goal of having the Jews just leave this land. I mean, the same day that there are rockets, Jews are still going to the beach in Tel Aviv. If an American was going to Lebanon to do a foreign exchange program, and all of a sudden Lebanon is being bombarded, I can guarantee you that those people would leave back to their home country. Yet Israelis are not leaving, and we're still living our lives. And that's a representation that no matter what you do, we will always live on this land. And you're using an anti-colonial tactic that could work against colonizers, but not only will not work against indigenous peoples, but that those indigenous peoples will just respond 100 times stronger because we are. And it's the same way that they would respond, not that they define the term indigenous, but they feel that this land is a part of their connection. It's the same way that they would respond if they had the upper hand. So I think they need to better understand us and our relationship to the land to understand what is appropriate and what isn't, and what would just backfire against them.
Thank you. What do you say about people who de-link anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and they say, look, I'm just being I'm against Israel, but not against the Jewish people, even though to us it comes across as very anti-Semitic?
It is completely anti-Semitic. Well, the first thing I do to someone that says that they're an anti-Zionist is I ask them to define Zionism and what they define it as that makes them anti. And then I know where the source of the problem is. So usually when I ask that question, they say, well, I'm against the conflict, I'm against occupation, I'm against this and that. And it's like, well, if that's what Zionism meant, then I'd also be against it. However, it's not up to non-Jews to define Zionism. It's up to Jews to define Zionism. And it's always meant one very specific thing, no matter if you're coming from the left, the right, religious, secular, even non-Jews supporting these ideas. Zion, which comes from Zion, which is a word for Jerusalem, is the idea that the Jewish people should have a right to self-determine on their ancestral homeland. And a form of anti-Semitism is to be against the empowerment and the self-determination of the Jewish people. So to bring this into context of the language that people can understand, is you explain to them, the Tibetans come from Tibet. They seek to one day come back to their homeland and to revive their Tibetan identity onto their homeland. If you're against the rights for the Tibetans to self-determine in Tibet, you are anti-Tibetan. If you're against Native Americans' rights to Standing Rock or to their native land, you're against the Native Americans. If you're against the right for Black people to have civil rights, you're anti-Black. If you're against the rights for Maoris to have their form of self-determination, you're anti-Maori. And there are many ways of being anti-Semitic. You can be for all Jews to be killed. You can be for all Jews to be kicked out of a country. You can be for all Jews to have different rights. There are many different ways to be xenophobic towards communities. And one of those ways to be anti-Semitic is to be against the right for the Jewish people to empower themselves and the right for the Jewish people to be able to self-determine, because that is what our culture needs, and that's what the standard is for all indigenous peoples, except towards the Jewish people. So yes, anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, even if it comes from Jews.
Thank you. Pro-Palestinians say it's virtually impossible to leave Gaza. Palestinians can't get passports, etc. Checkpoints all run by Israel. What is the answer to this? And then a larger question, which is finally, what is the overall solution to stop war?
So first of all, it is true what they're saying, that there's a blockade, both by air and by the sea, that Israel controls everything that goes in and out. That doesn't mean that things don't go in and out, but it's controlled by Israel. Israel also provides the electricity, the water, the food, a lot of the medical equipment and things like that to Gaza. So piece of context that is usually left out. But the reason that there's this situation, again, there's a why. Hamas was elected, and it's wrote in their original charter that it's their mission to wipe out all the Jews around the world and to start off with Israel, and that they've pushed these genocidal ambitions and constantly attacked Israel and targeted civilians, that it's gone to a level where Israel didn't have a choice and they created this situation. Does that mean that this situation is just? No. Does that mean that it's horrible that Palestinians are sort of trapped in Gaza? Absolutely. Does that mean also that Israel, with its power today, which is way more powerful than the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, has the responsibility to change it? Absolutely. Is Israel doing enough to change it? Absolutely not. Do we need to criticize Israel over that, and specifically the policies and the government for not doing that while praising them for other things that they do well? Yes, as well. But you cannot blame the consequences of war onto the people that are attacked. But those that are in power, whether the people that were attacked or the people that are doing the attacking, do have the responsibility to use that power to transcend the situation. And so there are many ways of being able to do that. Let's take the situation of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Let's leave Gaza for a side first, because I really believe first the issues with the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria must be solved first before dealing with Gaza. But something that Israel can start doing now is, for example, allowing freedom of speech. I'm part of a movement called Habayit that unites Israelis and Palestinians, that advocates and are activists for creating a reality where both Palestinians and Israelis experience this land as one, where we are able to achieve our aspirations, which actually don't contradict, and end the injustices that we experience, which also don't contradict. However, those individuals that I work with, which are local community leaders, cannot speak out publicly, because if they do, then they get arrested by the Palestinian Authority, tortured, and even sometimes killed for speaking out. So if I'm living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and something happens to me, there is a consequence. The government, the IDF, will take care and do something and find the people that are responsible for something happening to me, chas v'shalom. Now, if something happens to a Palestinian, nothing has happened. So I think it's Israel's responsibility to take, responsibility over this land and to protect all of its inhabitants, including Palestinians, and to allow people to have the freedom of speech on the Palestinian side so that those voices can be heard. And if there was a space created with a better option, not necessarily to be at all anti-Palestinian, very much so pro-Palestinian, very much so critical of the Israeli government, and to change things and to want to achieve their aspirations, but not in a way of being anti-Israel. If we allowed that space, then many Palestinians would choose that, because the options that are given as the youth comes into adulthood is only either don't get involved, or if you want to get involved, you have to be anti-Israel. If they were given a different option, if schools were named after people that sought to move things forward rather than blow buses up, if their thought leaders and role models were people that were trying to build unity within this land and still achieve their aspirations and not kill Jews, if the people in charge of the education were people like I'm describing, then you would see a shift, sure, a bit more long-term than just overnight, but then you would start seeing a shift within the society. So I think the first thing Israel needs to do is protect the freedom of speech and these individuals, for them to be able to express their ideas and show that there is another way. And then I think Israel should also invest in infrastructure in those communities, roads, education, building, sorts of healthcare, and show that we're taking responsibility over this land and change the relationship that Palestinians have with the state of Israel, so that they can experience Israel as something that is protecting them, something that is, giving them, benefits, and less so controlling them or seeing them as the enemy.
Thank you. How is Gaza getting all these weapons and missiles if not coming from Israel? Where do they come from?
Well, they're smuggled in. There are tunnels on the side of Egypt where the Sinai is very much so infiltrated by extremist groups. They're snuck in by sea as well. They're finding their way in, and usually we see these clashes or conflicts, wars happening once every 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, 5 years. And so in that time, they've had time to replenish their stock of missiles and rockets to get in. I mean, smuggling something happens all around the world in all places, and people find their ways to get things in. Most of it and a lot of it is sponsored by Iran, and they find their way to get their hands on it. So the solution is not to have a war every few years, or have a ground entrance by the IDF and to take out Hamas and then to leave and allow it to continue. It's to create the conditions for new leadership, for new ideas, to grow from within, for their people to elect better leadership that would be able to create something different between the two societies. Because again, although I understand why a lot of them in their worldview are fighting back, because they just see the context as we are being oppressed by Israel, we can't leave, we're stuck, we're trapped, and it's because of them. They don't have the information of why we're here in the first place. I understand why there's this desire to react and to revolt and to reject Israel. However, even if you wanted to do that, using the tactic of terrorism is suicide, because terrorism only works when you have a people that would be willing to leave if you terrorize them. If you're terrorizing local native peoples that will fight to the death and respond 100 times stronger with their 100 times force, it is the wrong tactic to use and will only continue to your demise. So I think that people need to understand that context, and Israel also needs to, again, take greater responsibility on the situation. And I don't think the politicians are doing enough of a good job. And it's also because of the structure of the government that forces politicians to focus on short-term strategies in order to get reelected, rather than long-term solutions in order to shift the region forward.
Thank you. Two more questions. First of all, why does nobody mention that Gaza is also a neighbor of Egypt and the West Bank's a neighbor of Jordan? Why does, with both these countries have much more land and more similarities, why these neighbors, two neighbors, never raised?
I mean, you have under 100,000 deaths in total from the Israeli-Arab wars, including Palestinians and Jews, and you have over 200,000 deaths in a span of a few years right north of us in Syria, and yet people are making an obsession about this rather than that. The reality is people don't care about the facts. They don't care about the numbers. They care about using facts and numbers to manipulate it and to push true political agendas, which in this case is the rejection of the Jewish people and the hatred of Israel, which comes for many reasons. There's even like Kabbalistic, holistic, spiritual reasons of why the Jews are hated in this world, of us not fulfilling our purpose, and thus the different nations of this world having a rejection to us not doing what we're supposed to do. But the reality is that people don't care about the facts, so we have to stop thinking, we not stop thinking rationally, but stop thinking that the whole world thinks rationally when it comes to us, because they don't.
But the counter question to that is that's what I started with, that a lot of people do feel this is kind of age-old anti-Semitism, and you are coming from the point that if you just educate people properly, they'll listen. But then when you break it down again, people are not rational. So even when you do explain it to them, they kind of resort back to the anti-Semitism. So how do you actually see a solution in terms of educating people?
Well, it depends how you're communicating. If you're communicating in a way, in a language that they don't understand, they're not going to understand. So if I'm selling this phone, okay, and I want to go to France, I have to speak in French in order to market this phone. If I go to the UK, I have to shift the language to English for people to understand what I'm trying to sell them. Now, although we're not selling a product, we are trying to communicate a story, and it's important to use the language for people to understand. That being said, it's not just about communicating, it's also about doing. Big reason for why we're fighting anti-Semitism is to unite the Jewish people and empower us for us to then do something. My understanding and conclusion as to why there's anti-Semitism, this is a very, for some people that aren't spiritual, for some people that don't see the world the way people that are more so spiritual see it, they may not really connect to this answer. But sure, there's a lot of things that the world hate the Jews for. Let's say jealousy. We tend to be successful. It's not because we're born that way. It's because part of our culture is about being successful. Like we said, Jews, help one another to rise to success. Jews for thousands of years, whereas the world only a few hundred years ago became completely literate. Like most people today know how to read and write. That wasn't the case a few hundred years ago, but the Jewish people always had their bar and bat mitzvahs and didn't know only how to read and write, but also how to ask deeper questions, because this rabbi made this argument and that rabbi made the counter argument. So it developed our critical thinking abilities and allowed us to be more cognizant of situations, more educated, and more doors open. So sure, there's a level of success that Jews have and a reaction to that success, but there are other communities around the world that are very successful and they don't bear the same amount of hatred. For example, Indians, not the Native Americans, but people from India in America, Asians in America, which there's been a recent spike in hatred, but not nearly the amounts that the Jewish people have, are very successful. And we look at New York, 13% of the community is Jewish. Over 55% of the total hate crimes are against Jews. So clearly something is off here, that it's not just success. It's not just dual loyalty of having this other identity, because I've mentioned Tibetans before. Tibetans also have this homeland and connection of being different. There's no hate movement against the Tibetans other than the Chinese that don't want that argument to be made so that they can keep Tibet. So it's not enough. So for me, the reason for why I think that there's anti-Semitism is it's a response to the Jewish people not doing their job. If the world is a body and each nation is an organ or system within the body, and each nation can choose what kind of system or organ. It can be half of this organ, half of that organ, two nations can be one organ, whatever function that we do, it's our choice of what we bring to the world. The function that the Jewish people chose upon themselves to do is to be the immune system. Meaning it's our job to do tikkun olam, to fix the world, and to bring light upon the world. And when we don't do that, when we don't fix and heal the other organs, when we don't allow the other organs to be able to achieve their potential within the body, there's a subconscious reaction of the other organs that are blaming us for the diseases in this world, not because we created it, but because there's a subconscious understanding that we're supposed to be the ones that fix it. And if we're not, then we're causing for it to happen in the first place. And that's my opinion, why you go from the far right to the far left, from the black supremacist to the white supremacist, in all layers of society, throughout time, throughout the world. Always the common enemy is the Jew. And the common enemy is the Jew because we are supposed to do something that we're not. And so we're being reacted to and responded to by hatred or rejection, because there's a sort of desire or understanding deep down, even if they don't consciously understand it, that we're supposed to do something. And when we don't, we're rejected for it. So I think anti-Semitism is sort of plan B. If the Jews aren't strong and united and fulfilling their purpose, the world will respond in this way, and it sort of like slaps us back into place. And so the question that we need to figure out in our generation is, what is plan A that we don't need plan B to wake up again?
Thank you very much. And now the final question, which is, when are you running, or why aren't you running for Prime Minister? I assume they meant of Israel, but they didn't specify. So why are you not? When are you running as Prime Minister for Israel? Will you?
So I get asked this question a lot, and my goal is not necessarily where am I going, but where more Am Yisrael is going. So I'm more so focused on where our collective is able to go and what we can do. That being said, the current political system is built that you either have right or left, which I'm neither. I reject this concept of divided society based on values. If you look at the people voting on the left, they care about humanity and morality and minorities and liberation and justice. And you look at the people voting on the right, they care about identity, they care about land rights, they care about security. And these values don't contradict themselves. They all put all together. And so I embody all those elements. So I don't identify on the right or on the left. There's things that I agree with on both sides and things that I disagree with on both sides. And I think we have to stop being sheep by political parties that are trying to control and divide us in order to maintain their power. That being said, if I go into politics, I'd have to choose right or left, which would automatically make half the country reject me. The second thing is I'd have to compete within a political party to be on top of the list, which then people play a dirty game and try to push each other down. And then inside of the government, you're in a situation, the way at least it's run right now, where you focus on what you can do in the short term in order to get reelected, because you might have a breaking coalition within months. So you don't have 4 years in front of you, you might have months in front of you. So politicians care more of what can I do now that I get a quick return, that I can use this to get reelected, rather than how can I make long-term changes for the society to move forward. So I don't think it's the best thing for me to go into that situation where I can't really be effective to helping Am Yisrael. If the future changed the way politicians worked and the situation was in the political system, then possibly. But either way, my goal is to move forward Am Yisrael, and there's other things that I'm doing that, in my opinion, are helping much more than being currently in the Knesset. For example, a big project that I'm involved in is something called We Were Never Lost. I'm actually going to send a link about it for people to learn more if you guys would like to learn more while I'm speaking. But this whole idea started actually while I was in the Chabad at Columbia University, where I was a student. And there was a woman who came to the Chabad house and gave a kippah to the Chabad rabbi that was very unique. And I asked her where she got this kippah from. And she said, I can only send you, Rabbi Weiss, a message. So I'm going to send you the
Send
link
it
if
to
you
me
can
and
forward it.
I'll forward it on.
Yeah, if you can forward it to the rest of the people. So I found out that this woman was like, I got this kippah from Africa, and there was a Jewish community in Uganda that we just met. And I'm like, Jews in Uganda? I've never heard of that. I only knew of Jews in Ethiopia. How is it that I don't know about this community? I came to Colombia to fight for Israel and against anti-Semitism. I did the army, and I'm passionate about Jewish history, and I don't even know of this existence. And I did research and I found out that there were Jews in Madagascar, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in Zimbabwe, in Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire, really all across Africa with different stories, some of which who have Jewish DNA that is proven they descend from Jews, some of which have historical records of, for example, the first Europeans coming into Nigeria and documenting 600 years ago that they're witnessing a community of Jews practicing Jewish culture, doing circumcision, speaking Hebrew before Christianity came into Africa. So it's not influenced by Christianity. There was actually a community doing there, and there's proofs of these communities existing. And we have this idea that there are lost tribes out there, and they are out there. The reality is that they're not lost. They knew who they were the whole time. It's just that they're lost to our consciousness. So we're working on a project of doing a documentary series, B'ezrat Hashem, for a very large streaming network that is mainstream on the stories of these communities. Each episode is going to be on a different community to bring them back to the consciousness of Am Yisrael, even bring them back if they would like to Israel, but also through telling their story, narrates the story of Am Yisrael. So I want the mainstream viewer to go through this really unique 6-episode series. Specifically, season 1 is on Africa, season 2 Asia and other places, but through each season have the different layers of the collective story of the Jewish people being unveiled. So episode number 1 is on the Lemba, which there's a community within the Lemba called the Buba that are sort of the priests or the Kohanim, and they are in charge of all spiritual things such as circumcision and Nida and different religious Abrahamic traditions. And these Jewish geneticists from Columbia University that are doing advancements on genetics at Columbia decided to test them and do the Cohen gene test to see if they have the Y haplotype on the paternal line. And they found that they have the same percentage of Cohen gene than any other Cohen in the world. So it's scientifically proven that the Jews that are Black, like the other people living in Zimbabwe, actually descend from Jews. And in fact, their name Lemba in the local language means a people wandering with heavy luggage, which already makes sense to the story of the Jewish people. So episode number 1 is going over the fact that the Jewish people descend from a physical genetic culture, and people were not just some religion that crossed over borders, or physical people that were forced to cross over those borders and created Judaism as a portable suitcase of our identity, way of life, culture, spirituality, in order to preserve it l'dor v'dor, generation to generation, and to bring it back home, Shana B'Yerushalayim, and revive it in our homeland. Episode number 2 is on the Abba Yudaya in Uganda, which converted to Judaism in 1917, and they're already 3rd generation born Jewish. They've been massacred by Idi Amin for being Jewish, and I think one of the biggest testaments to see if you're truly a Jew is when you're being massacred for being a Jew. Are you still going to stand with it, or are you going to reject it? And the second episode is, what does it mean to be a convert? Are you just accepting a belief system like becoming a religion? You accept Jesus, you become a Christian. You accept Muhammad, you become a Muslim. Or are you going through a process of ridding yourself of all the spiritual impure idols that were given by your culture, and joining a nation and adopting its history, adopting its culture, its language, connection to a land, its purpose, its suffering that comes along with it. So episode number 2 is focused on the idea of people being converts within our culture. Episode number 3 is on the Igbos who are living in Nigeria. It just so happens to be that they're the richest ethnic group in all of Africa, and also that the ethnic groups in Nigeria all blame the Igbos, which comes from Hebrews, all blame the Igbos for being the source of the problems of society. I mean, I think every Jew that knows Jewish history all of a sudden finds patterns that their experience is almost identical to ours. And point being that each episode is breaking down a different layer of the collective story of the Jewish people. So work like that that helps reunite and bring back millions of Jews. For those that are afraid of demographic problems, I don't think that we'd have demographic problems if we were able to awaken the lost tribes and include them in our society, but also simultaneously tell the story of Am Yisrael to the world for people to fundamentally understand who we are. I don't think I can do that in a seat in the Knesset debating with other people issues that are irrelevant to moving Am Yisrael forward.
Thank you very, very much for everything. Just one, I said no more questions. I don't want to lie. So this is more of a comment, and you should treat it as a comment with a question mark, and maybe you can answer it, which is exactly, which is firstly, just 1 or 2 book recommendations for all the, all the answers to all the things that people have asked. If you know any just great readers. And secondly, just a message of hope to all the school children in England and in diaspora in general. Just to finish on that note, and and we'll conclude with that. So I just want to say in advance of that, thank you very much, Rudy. This is you're 2 for 2. You hit it out of the park both times. It's a shame that that it was needed so quickly, but it's really inspirational to have you on, and it means so much to us here that we have such a valiant voice of our people, so confident, so eloquent, so well spoken, and but obviously the guy who thought you should be prime minister disrespects you, but I'm sure he also meant it with tremendous respect. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And just to finish on those 2 notes.
So in terms of recommendations of where to get information, I recommend everyone to just binge watch the videos that I make, because I made them in order for people to be prepared and to deal with those situations. And it's not just me talking, most of them are debates. So how to deal with live situations where people are giving counter information and how to deal with it. For example, something often used is where are your grandparents from? Because they want us to say the UK, they want us to say Morocco, they want us to say Poland, and then that would allow them to say, oh, so you're from there, why don't you go back? And because I already am aware of why they're asking this question in this first place, I'm saying my grandparents and all of my people are from Israel. Now, if you want to know where we were born in other places, some of us because we were physically displaced from our land, and you as a Palestinian or Palestinian activist, I don't think you would be making the argument that the Palestinian now born 2nd, 3rd generation in the diaspora does not come from that land. So don't apply double standard to my people. And so a lot of these things of how to respond to those situations are in those videos to prepare people for those situations, which, to be honest, I think the Jewish community should have prepared the next generation of Jews a long time ago. And I think most of the Jewish community is now waking up. But previously, when I grew up, they taught Jews in the diaspora how to be Jews in theory and not in practice, how to put tefillin and to keep Shabbat and to do the Passover Seder, which is all very important, but not how to deal with anti-Semitism, understand counter narratives, be able to debate, have the courage to get into situations like that, be armed with how to create coalitions and understand the narratives against our people, or to find a way to include those narratives in ours for other people to have a better option than just being against us while still being for another people. So in terms of book list, Rabbi, if you want to send me an email, I'll send you a picture of a bunch of different books, and then people can choose which one they would like depending on the subject. I think that's a lot easier. And a message to the youth. First of all, a lot of people look at me as, wow, we have someone finally that is standing for Israel and is so well spoken and this and that, but I'm not the answer. If it's just me continuing this my whole life, I'm going to make change, but I'm not going to change the outcome that we're going to have. The point of me doing this is to empower others. My favorite quote is that a true leader does not create more followers, they create more leaders. And so I think it's very important for everyone that is listening, young or old, to realize that we all have a responsibility to spread light into this world. And that ability changes. So I would not leave it with an answer. As a good Jew, I would leave it with a question. Ask yourselves every moment of your life. I do it every morning when I put tefillin, but you can do it every year, every 6 months. Ask yourselves, what are the problems that you see around you? They can be micro problems of situations right in front of you with your family or in your workspace or in your school, or macro problems of how education is being done, or politics are being done, or economics are being done. Find the problems that you see, because there's a reason why you see it. Hashem put you in this world to be able to see this problem. Look at the skills that you have. Like, let's say you're good at graphic design. Let's say you're good at being a musician or being a doctor or being whatever it is. Find your skills, enhance those skills, develop them, try to add on other skills that you have, and use those skills in order to fix the world in the problems that you see. And ask yourself this question not once in your life, but often, because as your situation changes and as time goes, you will develop more skills and you will see different problems, and that you have a responsibility to fix the problems that you see in whatever way. So that's what I can leave off for people to reflect and search within themselves. What do they see? What do they have? And how they can develop what they can have in order to fix those problems that they see.
Thank you so much. It was really, really amazing. Have a wonderful night, everybody. Rudy, you've earned your rest now. You can at 11:40 go to sleep. Have a great night. Thank you very, very much, everyone, for listening. God bless you all.